Okay, you guys can hear me, perfect. So my name is Hartsuiker. That's a name, it's an old Dutch name, it means sugar heart, so I'm a bit of a sweetheart. I'm going to start talking about the 5 basic things of the GDPR that you should already know by now, but just in case anyone's been sleeping or has been outsourcing this to their legal teams, I'm just going to go through them very quickly. So first of all, the GDPR applies to the European Union, but we have a saying in IAB Europe that Europe is everywhere, because it not only applies to companies who are based in Europe that do data processing. Anyone who processes the data of people who are in the EU, whether or not they're European or from wherever, you need to make sure that you comply with the law, and that person's data needs to be handled in a respectful way according to the laws of the GDPR. Even if you don't technically have to comply with it in a legal sense, your partners might say, if you don't have a high enough standard of data protection, it's too much of a risk for me to send my data to you. So when you're thinking of GDPR, there's too much uncertainty to say that you're not in Europe, essentially. So personal data is what's covered by the GDPR. We say that all data is personal data. It's not really true, but it will be true eventually. And we've had great examples today of how everything is becoming smart. I think someone mentioned the word smart lamppost or dumb lamppost earlier. The more data we collect, the more things can be matched, the more things are unique. Anytime you can single out one person from the rest of the world, you have something that is considered personal data. So we're past the era of what's called personal identifying information, or PII. We just have personal data. If it's pseudonymized, it doesn't matter, because it's still data that's relevant to one person, and you could, in theory, identify them, or somebody else could. Then you have personal data. So if you are in Europe, which we think is everywhere, if you process personal data, which could be anything, the GDPR applies. So what can you do with that data? You're not allowed to process personal data under the GDPR unless you comply with one of 6 legal bases. One of those is consent, another one is legitimate interest, and there's a few other ones which are more technical, such as to save a human life or in the public interest, contractual reasons, so you can't sign a contract without knowing somebody's name, for example. These kind of things are more straightforward, but the big 2 for online advertising and marketing is really consent and legitimate interest. If you can get that far, you've managed to make an excuse for processing someone's personal data. You need to make sure that you can provide users with their data subject rights. So everyone whose data is being processed is a data subject. They are entitled to ask you, or whoever's in charge of the processing, who makes the decisions about the processing, what is the data you have on me? Can I have it, please? Can I port it to somebody else? Can you please erase the data? Can you correct the data if it's wrong? So these are all things that you have to keep in mind. And lastly, don't forget there's already a cookie directive in place. Some of you may have heard of the ePrivacy regulation. That's a law that's being made, but it's an upgrade to a law that already exists in every European Union member state, which means that you need consent, user consent, opt-in consent, to get access to their device, to their computers, to their phones. If you want to read any information on there, you need to have their consent. So even if you have another legal basis for processing, you still need to ask the user if you can collect their data in the first place. And that is going to change with the GDPR. The standard of consent is going to get much higher. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. So those are the 5 basics, the refresher. Yeah, so what does that have to do with marketing? Well, I don't even have to explain it, because we've had talks all day, and I think yesterday as well, explaining what you can do with data and making things more personal, speaking to people as if you know them in an older situation. Now you have all this data about people, that you know quite a lot about these people, even if you don't know their name or their address or their phone number or their email address. It doesn't matter, because you already know a lot about a person. You have profiles. But even something as simple as someone clicking on an ad campaign, they get on the landing page, you want to know how they got there, where they saw this ad, where they clicked from. That kind of data is very easily within the realm of personal data. So having gone over these basics, I'm going to get a little bit of audience interaction. Can everyone put up their hands and say that they're 100% confident that they're GDPR compliant? Nobody? That question always gets asked in these kind of conferences. I'm sure there's some people who are very confident, but to be 100% confident is something else. And I'm going to hand over to Chris now, my fellow Chris. He's going to talk about how ready people actually are